Hello, and welcome to Mastery Paths During a Pandemic. I am Dr. Amanda Blaisdell. I am Assistant Professor of Health Education, Health Promotion, and Public Health at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. Let's start with an overview of this course. I've taught human sexuality at Longwood for about 4 years now. And I've also conducted human sexuality research. And it's a very, very interesting field for me, but I do recognize that the content is highly sensitive in nature. I have noticed a trend that my students come to class with anxiety about their knowledge of human sexuality. They come in with diverse experiences or no experience to speak of for sex education prior to enrolling in the course, and they all feel like they're at some big old deficit. Little do they realize they're all at the same place with that. But where they're truly unique is their different comfort levels, their experiences, perspectives, beliefs, and values when it comes to human sexuality. Now we're going to mix that with challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought on mental and emotional health concerns, just general fatigue, feeling overwhelmed, stressed, kind of interesting, wonky, funky, innovative, hybrid, synchronous, asynchronous, face-to-face, a mix of scheduling and course modalities that bring on a whole bunch of other challenges. Longwood was face-to-face this year, and some students had the opportunity to get what's known as an adaptation. They were able to request being fully online for some of their courses. Because we were face-to-face, we had to meet social distancing regulations, mask wearing, cleaning, quarantine, and whatnot. So those were some other curveballs that we had to juggle. Classroom capacities were greatly reduced. So a lot of classes were split into AB and some even ABC. For me, luckily, I had the numbers to only do AB. But instead of doing on campus, off campus, here you are on Tuesday, coming to class, Thursday you're Zooming, I opted to do 2 35-minute sessions. So this was to try to have some more continuity with the students because coming off of COVID-19, they really did want some personal interactions that were meaningful, and they wanted meaningful assignments. Don't waste my time. If you're going to get me here, if I'm going to put in all this work while I'm fatigued and struggling, it better be worth it. So unfortunately, we kind of we drew the short straw for the time. It was 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. So it was split into 2 35-minute classes, an A and a B, with 5 minutes in between that I ran around the room and I sprayed disinfectant and all that stuff to try to make sure that we were meeting all the CDC's policies there. I told the students I am not going to enforce an attendance policy, which was certainly risky business considering I was asking them to show up Tuesday and Thursday at 8 a.m. or 8:40 for only 35 minutes. I was wondering if I was going to kick myself later for not having a true attendance policy, but ultimately I had outstanding attendance throughout the whole semester. Even with an 8 a.m. or 8:40 start for these groups, I was very impressed. All materials were provided online so that students who did have an adaptation or were quarantining could stay up to date. I opted out of group work for that reason. I mean, if you have a peer and they're quarantining, that makes things complicated. Plus, with the highly sensitive content and the uniqueness of each student when it comes to human sexuality content, I have had a lot of students in the past say, please don't ever give us group work. We love discussions. We love doing things together, but no group assignments because we don't necessarily see eye to eye. Fair enough. I'm not trying to add any stress or conflict here. Zoom was only by request, and actually some students took me up on that when they could not attend, especially students who felt like Nothing really came close to the 35-minute environment. All the classes were recorded on Zoom, however, made available to some students. This would be a prototype for online. I was going to also offer this class fully online in the winter intersession, which is approximately 4 weeks. And I had never taught this class online before. I had been told by students and administration and colleagues, there's no way you're going to reach the level of success with this class online. It's just, you won't be there, you won't be in front of them, you won't be facilitating these activities, it just won't, you're going to be disappointed. Well, I said, let's test that. And let's test mastery paths. So this would be a prototype in the fall for what online would look like in the winter. For the fall, however, students who attended class, or didn't attend class rather, were not allowed to do the in-class assignment. I didn't actually enforce this. More on this in the future when we move on throughout this presentation. And for the online group, there is no such thing as an in-class option. It was just 3 options because that's all that mastery paths for each path really can afford you. So let's talk about that. What's a mastery path? Well, it's a set of differentiated assignments based on choice or need. So imagine you've got an assignment and it is a lower level skills assignment on Bloom's taxonomy, and they need to demonstrate proficiency before they can move on. And then when they move on, they may be able to select how they move on because they're proficient. Or imagine this, they do not reach proficiency with that assessment. Therefore, their path that is predicted for them is going to be remedial in nature, and then they might be reassessed before they can move on. So it's really about trying to get them to mastery or proficiency in order to continue with the course with built-in remediation and or built-in student choice. So all these pathways start with an assessment so that you can kind of get this foundation level data about where the student's at. I chose to use an open note, no time limit, multiple attempt quiz. In the fall, these quizzes were due right before, the night before, we would transition to a new student learning outcome in class. They did have a due date, but there was no penalty for students submitting late. I didn't tell them this. They just kind of recognized that there was no penalty if they, missed a due date. That really didn't stop them, though. They really tried to keep those due dates. They tried to submit them on time, and an overwhelming majority of them did. They met proficiency before coming to class, which was pretty huge in the success of trying to somewhat flip the classroom. The students, however, could not see which questions were incorrect, and the questions came out of a quiz bank specific to that student learning outcome, and every time they took the assessment again, they got a new set of 20 questions. So for some students who wanted to just click, click, click and see how that worked out without actually really putting in a solid attempt, which I'm sure we've all experienced at some point, clicking through a quiz that's multiple attempt 100 times to see if you can randomly statistically end up where you need to be, that doesn't typically tend to work out. So students realized the best way to achieve this was to go through each question and look up the answer, feel confident in that answer, and then submit the quiz. That is what most students did. I did have one freshman, however, and you may see in some of the data tables that are in this presentation, the quiz problems comes up for at least one person for a majority of the questions, because this freshman probably would take each quiz about 40 or 50 times and spend about 1, 2, 3, I think a maximum of 9 seconds on a question before answering, but would take that assessment probably 40 times and email me and say, Dr. Blaisdell's quiz is too hard. And all it took was a screenshot of their quiz analytics to say, really, buddy? Looks like I'm not really getting the good old college try here. So just disregard that. So from the student's end, here's an example of what they'd see for their first student learning outcome. Explain what human sexuality is in general terms. So they have what I like to put in every single Canvas course, every single Canvas wiki, are these HTML tabs where they can tab over from one wiki to another wiki page or toggle over. All of their assignments, including their quizzes, had this so that I could organize the content and streamline the content and declutter the Canvas modules. So you'll see here the language that I use, letting them know they can take it as many times as they need. They need a C or better before moving on to their options. Open note, they click on that literature tab, which they have access to throughout the whole quiz, and they can look for the answers. If they don't have a C or better, they're going to need to retake it in order to move on. So they could play around with this literature tab and scroll through to look up all their answers. Most students had 1 or 2 attempts, but few had more than that, unless they're like my buddy who felt like 40 times the charm. On my end, this is what it looked like. Since I only really had one threshold, 70%, for a 20-point quiz, that was 14 correct answers. So when they reach 14 correct answers, they have 3 options in front of them. For them, they get them not horizontally, but they're listed more vertically, and it looks like a wiki page, and then a wiki page below it, and a wiki page below that, that they could look at fully. So they could completely examine SLO option 1. Toggle through the different tabs, look at the requirements, look at the assignment, interact with the materials and the artifacts before making a selection. Now, unfortunately, once a student makes a selection, they can't change their mind unless they contact me, and then I can, on the back end, I can change their selection for them. But it was really important to me to give them these differentiated options because, of course, this highly sensitive nature of human sexuality meant I needed to have almost a gradient of emotional, cultural, belief-based challenge. The rigor was the same. No matter what, they were all going to be examining an artifact and pulling the content out of it, making assertions, aligning the content, justifying their answers with these artifacts. But the artifacts were very different. Option 1 was typically very PG rated. It didn't contain explicit material. It didn't really challenge anyone's beliefs. It really didn't even get into beliefs hardly at all, other than maybe human rights. SLO option 2, we're getting into PG-13 territory. These are some concepts that some may find mildly offensive or could challenge some beliefs. And then there's the SLO 3 option, my favorite, which was also the in-class option for the fall. Now, even though that's the in-class option, if we had time, we might also do the PG-13 option in class as well. But in the fall, at the start of every SLO, I thoroughly went over the 3 options in class and explained them and aligned them and talked about how they were related to the SLO. But SLO option 3, these were the fun ones. They ranged from PG-13 that may disturb some audiences to an rated R NC-17 artifact that added an extra, I'd say, emotional or cultural layer of challenge. These are options that people will either find hilarious, offensive, or disturbing. Particularly explicit options had big red warning labels on them about language, nudity, offensive qualities that may trigger somebody. I certainly didn't want anybody who's experienced any trauma who thought that they might have fun with an SLO option 3, then later regret it since they couldn't really change their selection without reaching out to me. I definitely didn't want to trigger anybody with the SLO option 3s. But these were a lot of fun, and these were ones that we broke down in class because as a facilitator of a learning environment, I have no problem going over this type of an assignment and this artifact in class and facilitating the conversations around that, keeping it serious, making it educational, and having talking points, and even some SLO2 options as well. And a lot of students ended up choosing the SLO option 3 when they did attend class. And a lot of students as well in the winter enjoyed the option 3. And they're all in college. They're all adults. Nothing is inappropriate for them, but they got to make that decision ultimately. So from my end, this is what it looks like. I built in all the options, organized in the module. The students don't see this. They see this. They see their path. When they move on, they see everything's locked, but then they move on, and after they pass the assessment with a 70% or better, they can click next and be brought to their options. Well, if they navigate out of that, they can always go back to the modules and they can click on the options and make their selection. Some students, however, would forget to do this, and we talk about that later. But I would say if you're thinking about exploring mastery paths in your classroom, make sure that the assessment that they take before they choose their path or land in remedial territory, that it can be graded in Canvas and you don't have to grade it. That way your grading doesn't hold up their progress in the course. Why did I think mastery paths would be effective for these COVID-19 and human sexuality challenges? Well, I definitely wanted to increase engagement. And differentiation helps increase engagement. Students don't want busy work. There is a litany of research out there on the students' perspectives of COVID-19 based education, and they want really impactful assignments and no busy work. They wanted comfort with sensitive content. Well, I wanted this for them probably more than anything. I haven't really received any complaints from students about the content. Most students would say, oh, it was scary and I was nervous at times, but by the end of the course I felt empowered and I felt very desensitized to the information and comfortable with it and got rid of the stigma. But I felt like there was no need to try to force them into that territory. So some students, especially after completing the quiz and looking at the SLO options, could pretty much predict what class was going to be like. And if it was going to trigger them or make them uncomfortable, they didn't have to attend. And they could pick less challenging content for their assignment at home. Some students had to be fully online during the fall, and trying to, in a sense, flip the classroom by having them take these foundational quizzes before coming to class and interacting with the artifacts definitely saved time, and I was on a time crunch with only 35-minute half classes for these students. And it really simplified the transition to an online section with little compromise. An online version of a class shouldn't be easier, and it shouldn't be harder. Mastery Paths helps me ensure that there's consistency in rigor and expectations. Even though students won't have the in-person experience, that might not be everyone's cup of tea for this type of content. It's also entirely possible that some students selected the winter version of Human Sexuality over the fall version because they did not want to deal with awkward feelings in the classroom, being confronted with this content around their peers or their professor. Completely understandable. I had 2 different graded surveys in the fall and in the winter, and these were approved by Longwood University's IRB. Participation was voluntary. All students received marginal extra credit, even one student who submitted the surveys and just left blank spaces for all of the answers. She got her extra credit. Doesn't bother me one bit. So for both courses, these were the 2 data points: midpoint of the course and endpoint. I wanted to do repeated measures because I felt like midpoint would not adequately reflect their true feelings about mastery paths. And I say that because some of the gripes or concerns that they may have had, they may not have at the end, or some of the things they thought were great about mastery paths, they may have changed their mind by the end. And to be honest, for some students, that happened. So now we're going to get into the questions. The fall group had 8 questions, and the winter group had 7. The fall group, they had the same questions except for one. Fall had a question about attendance, and we'll get to that later. But other than that, they had the exact same language. So here's the first question. So now that it's reached its midpoint, endpoint, please provide specific feedback regarding your positive, negative, or mixed experience with being required to choose your assignment. There was not a single student who had a negative sentiment about this. And not surprisingly, although it was possible, and I didn't want to rule out that students wouldn't have the sentiment of, oh, just tell me what to do, please, don't make me pick. But out of 3 options, it wasn't necessarily asking them to do that much more by making the choice themselves. In fact, a lot of students said it really improved flexibility. They could tailor to personal strengths. It helped engage them more with the content because they got to do what they wanted to do. But what's really interesting is the tailoring to personal comfort increased from 1 student to 5 students. And I think this is meaningful because at the beginning of the semester, they were learning foundational concepts. What's human sexuality? How is human sexuality influenced? What is the form and function of genitalia and arousal? And then it moved on to more socially constructed themes to which people's beliefs are challenged, or they may have a little bit more discomfort, or they may just basically be in uncharted territory. So it was not surprising that in the fall, at the end of the semester, more students said, yeah, it was a nice benefit to pick assignments based on my comfort level. But who knows how many students who said, I love the flexibility of it, were thinking that. We may never know. I'll have to conduct another survey for that. For the winter, with the same question, what's interesting is the comfort issue never even came up. Not a single student even mentioned the word comfort or a sentiment similar to that. But a lot of students said it was engaging, flexibility, tailoring to my strengths. But at the end, it all kind of just boiled down to flexibility. It was very interesting. One student did say that they were frustrated that they couldn't change their mind when they wanted to change their SLO option. I mean, they could. They just had to reach out to me, which they knew, but it was just a pain. They didn't want to add an extra step and then wait for me to switch it for them. Makes it less flexible. Well, here's a question for them about having to earn a 70% or better. Now, 70% is not really proficiency or mastery. I mean, it's approaching, but I didn't want to raise that threshold too much because I really wanted to reduce barriers and burdens, and I felt like 70% was enough to get them started for class and enough to give them a good foundation for their SLO assignments, understanding fully that they may have to go back and refer to that material. Completely understandable. So what about this minimum score? Well, a lot of students said it prepared them for class, it prepared them for the SLO, it held them accountable for their grades, and it helped them learn. At the end point, those themes were still very present, but a new theme emerged. It reduced their stress that they had this 70% threshold. Some students spoke to, well, I didn't really have to worry about my grade too much because when all of your quiz grades are a 70% or better, naturally that's going to help your grade. And then they also, held them accountable for moving on in the course, period. Nobody wanted to be stuck behind. They wanted to be able to have a taste of what we were covering in class. For the winter, we didn't have that class, but a lot of students still said it held them accountable, it helped them learn, reduced their stress, and prepared them for their SLO assignments, which is, after all, the whole goal. Now, what about completing those SLO quizzes in a specific order? This was absolutely a decision that I made to micromanage them. In the past, when I've had assignments that are supposed to build and I just open them up, you know what happens. They go and they pick something that looks interesting and they think maybe it looks easy and they do it. They don't do it particularly well, or it could have been better, and they're disorganized in the class. This information builds, starting with foundational concepts and then moving to more complex sociocultural concepts, and the students recognize that. They said that it prepared them for class, they said that it kept them on track, and they said that it organized the content. A lot of students said, well, I didn't have a problem with it. I think it was great. General, neutral sentiments of, well, I really didn't care either way. Only one student at the end of the semester was like, yeah, I did not like that. Well, what about completing the SLO quizzes in a specific order in the winter? The same logic applies, and we had a lot of students saying, well, it prepared me. It prepared me for the homework, or it didn't bother me at all. Some students, well, one student said they preferred the reverse order. Give me the artifact, make me do the assessment, and then give me the quiz. That's not necessarily according to best practices in education, or really the goal of the SLO assignments, but hey, they're entitled to their opinion. Two students said make them all available, just open everything up. But the truth of the matter is, if I ever did that as a social experiment, I'm pretty confident that students will say, I really wish you didn't make that decision. And then here we go to kind of echoing that sentiment that I just anticipated. So open due dates for SLO assignments. If you look at the midpoint, we have a lot of students that said it reduced their stress to not have a specific due date for their SLO assignments in the fall. So what did this really look like? They had to be accountable for their quizzes before coming to class when we transitioned to different SLOs, but I told them, you can complete the SLO assignments anytime throughout the semester. This is to increase flexibility. This is to help you manage your life during a pandemic. This is to help you juggle your competing priorities. But please, please, please do not logjam them right up at the end and then have to do a whole semester in a week's time. Please don't do this to yourself. And don't do it to me. I don't want to grade all of that right at the end. So, students appreciated that, and they said it did give them flexibility and it reduced their stress. Some students were very honest at the midpoint. They had mixed feelings. They said, it's great, I appreciate it, but I don't trust myself, and I'm a procrastinator. I really need due dates. And those two themes of enjoying the flexibility but having mixed feelings were proportionately similar between the semester midpoint and the end of the semester. Well, what about open due dates for those SLO assignments for winter online? Similar sentiments of flexibility and reducing stress. One student just came out and said, I need due dates. And then there were some general negative sentiments about SLO assignments and having open due dates. And one student said it improved her work quality. And this is primarily because by design, if a student getting into the more complex student learning outcomes, like let's say the concept of gender in today's society or gender nonconformity, right? They might take the quizzes and have that 70% threshold, but still not feel super confident with the concept to complete the SLO assignment. But later on in the semester, as gender concepts and other theories are peppered in throughout the SLOs, then they can go back and say, I am so ready to tackle that gender assignment. Students also had similar sentiments in the fall. They felt like, having more time to complete them when I felt confident was a huge benefit and flexibility. Well, what about having the specific due dates for the quizzes? I already micromanaged that they had to be in a specific order. Well, I also micromanaged that they had specific due dates, even though I didn't penalize them if it was late. What's amazing, it's almost like this, I don't know what you would call it, this type of effect, where they see a due date, and the due date's in Canvas, but the due date is essentially meaningless when it comes to their grade. Of course, the ultimate due date is always the end of the semester, no matter what, unless you give an extension. But students felt like seeing those due dates in Canvas actually held them accountable and prepared them for class, made sure that they came to class with that foundational knowledge. They really appreciated those due dates for those reasons. Some students had mixed feelings because they were like, well, if I was busy the night before, I would have appreciated the flexibility to take the quiz later, and I know that I could have, but I felt stressed and pressured to get it in by the due date, even if it was going to be challenging. Some students said extend the due date. It kept the class organized. And interesting enough, 2 students at the midpoint said it increased their stress, but nobody echoed that sentiment at the end of the semester. Well, what about those specific due dates for quizzes in the winter? Well, we had a variety. We have a whole rainbow of different sentiments for the midpoint. Neutral, mixed feelings, it kept me on track, I don't really like it, keep due dates with no late penalty, gotcha, focus as the content, if you don't have a late penalty, then ditch the due dates. Well, at the end of the semester, it ended up being mostly, it really kept me on track. Well, here's the attendance question that I was really curious about. Since students who came to class were now all of a sudden eligible for the in-class SLO homework, although I was not about to police that. If somebody who didn't attend class completed that, I was going to grade it. They didn't know that, though. How did they feel about that? Practicing an in-class homework and using 1 or 2 SLO options as examples to dig in. How did they feel about that? Was it repetitive? Did they not like it? Did it encourage attendance? Well, some students said, yeah, it did encourage attendance. The general neutral sentiments were basically, I was going to come to class anyway. But a lot of students said, I love the fact that you went over the homeworks in class and used those as our learning artifacts and examples because it absolutely prepared me for the homework on my own. And you would think that even though I went over these artifacts in class, that almost all the students who completed, say, the in-class option would have the same answers. They did not. These assignments are not Googleable. There are multiple different ways that people can interpret and apply the information to these artifacts. So I still got a variety of completely unique submissions, which all went through Turnitin, by the way. And I didn't have to deal with any plagiarism either, which was beautiful. It really showed that they were applying themselves to the content. Well, what's their overall experience with the fall, with our 35-minute experience? Well, we had a lot of students say it was just engaging, just to come to class and just get down to brass tacks. Let's just talk about it. Let's dive into the homework. We already have a taste of the information from the previous evening. Like, let's go. A lot of students said that coming to class and having class with me really was the icing on the cake, which is nice. And it echoes the concerns that I have been told in the past about it just won't be the same. If you're not teaching the class face to face, I'm sure these students would prefer the face-to-face option over online, and that is their right. A lot of students said they really enjoyed the structure, the mastery path structure. They felt like it was organized. They felt like they knew where they were going, what they were doing, and how to get there. One student said it added normalcy. I even have the quote here off to the side. Even though times are really difficult, this class has added normalcy. We can be in person, but also work in line. The topics and activities are engaging and interesting, and I want to learn more. I was really kind of hoping for that as an unintended consequence, that having them come every class time, even if it was for half the time, to give us that continuity of seeing each other would help them feel better during this pandemic. For the winter online, what was their overall experience? Well, we have another rainbow of sentiments that ended up being boiled down into basically just two. It was engaging and I learned a lot. They offered some constructive feedback, which I will certainly consider. Use one textbook instead of multiple open educational resources. Too much content, streamline it. Don't give me zeros for missing work until the end, because if they did not make their selection after a certain amount of time has passed, I made it for them for SLO option 1, the most benign option, and I gave a placeholder 0 to get their attention. Didn't like that. Well, just trying to keep you on track. Nobody wants to think that they have an A and then at the end of the term find out they have a 26%. Well, how would the fall students feel like they could improve? This is where I was looking for some more of that constructive criticism. What do they have for me? Well, an overwhelming proportion of them said nothing. But what's interesting was at the end of the semester in the fall, we had this new topic area emerge. Please give assignments due dates. All assignments. SLO quizzes, keep the due dates, and SLO assignments, please give them due dates. Even if you're not going to take away points, I can do that. The only issue that I see with that, it may not be an issue at all, I'll have to practice it, but I have noticed in the past with due dates, even if I won't penalize for things being late, sometimes there's this phenomena of students thinking, the due date passed, I didn't do it, I can't do it. It's going to be a 0. Throw their hands in the air and say, I'm not going to pass this class, too much has been lost, and disengage. But that's just going to take more strategies on my end to make sure that they know. Well, how did the winter think it could be improved? At the midpoint, we had 2 different camps who believed that nothing should be fixed and that there should be textbook or professor notes. Basically, these students didn't want open educational resources. They wanted me to custom design and tailor the reading and content materials for them. That's something that I could do. That's something that I've done in the past. That's something I've done for face-to-face classes, for other types of assignments. But I think they feel more comfort with this. They don't want to read a textbook. And we can see that the shorter readings or less content theme also emerged here because they definitely don't want to feel overwhelmed. And I completely understand that. Neither do I. So what are some of the challenges that I experienced? Well, the mastery paths option due dates, actually they have to be re-entered after a student selects it. After reading some of their feedback in the survey at the midpoint where students had mixed feelings about due dates, and I was noticing that lots of students were not making their SLO option selection and their grade wasn't accurate based on missed work, I started going in and putting in due dates. Still not taking away any points if it was late, but putting in due dates so that it would come up on their Canvas to-do list and things like that, and just really grab their attention a little bit more. But even if I put a due date, the minute a student selects it, I have to put in another due date. Odd. Like the due date is assigned to Mastery Paths, but Mastery Paths is not a person. So once Jenna signs up for it, I have to assign a due date to Jenna and other students who are going to select it. That was tedious, but as long as I was organized, it was overcome. There were some glitches that I wasn't able to fix that I still can't kind of figure out. Students who don't make those selections end up with inaccurate grade estimates. For the fall, some students made selections but didn't do the work. In the winter, some students made selections and didn't do the work or didn't make selections. Of course, I would make the selection for them, ultimately put in a placeholder 0 when we got closer to the end of the semester so I could be like, hello, pay attention, you're gonna run into some dangerous territory if you don't get these done. And then also students may change their mind but cannot change their selection without reaching out to me, which is definitely an added barrier. I wish they could make their reselect, if you will. Major takeaways. Differentiation with mastery paths absolutely increases engagement and student satisfaction. Now, obviously, I can't really generalize past these two cohorts, but this was the overwhelming sentiment that echoed throughout all of the data. They liked it. They loved it. It was organized. It kept them on track. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to how you organize mastery paths. Some want due dates, some don't, but it's highly situational. A student who doesn't run into snags in their personal life or other courses may not feel the same as another student. So any way you can reduce barriers whenever possible is better, but we also have to protect them from themselves. Procrastinating students need deadlines and they need discipline. And I'd like to be able to offer that to them without penalizing them. But unfortunately, there's also a territory where if you're not penalizing me, it is all for show and they may still procrastinate. So this is definitely, we're not solving world hunger here with this one. We may never be able to find a feasible solution for everybody when it comes to due dates and reducing barriers, but we can try. And mastery paths is only as effective as the professor. I would not suggest that novice professors or instructors redesign their whole course with mastery paths. Probably a better idea to dabble, try it, add some assignments and assessments this way, and then create the graded surveys to get feedback from students about what worked and didn't work. You have to be completely open to feedback and criticism. You have to be completely open to the student's perspective if you're truly putting students first. And I believe that Mastery Paths is a feature that aligns with my philosophy of reducing barriers and putting students first. If a professor can strategically design content according to best practices in education, online or otherwise, then this should not be a problem. But disorganized, unrealistic expectations, tedious work, a whole bunch of extra steps, just compromises the whole goal of what we're trying to accomplish here and getting students where we want them to go. Honestly, I was a naysayer myself about how effective a comprehensive sex ed class could be, because I naively thought that myself as a facilitator was going to be a huge driver of that success. And even though I believe I complement my curriculum by teaching face-to-face, I also believe that this online version of human sexuality is just as successful, especially for students who don't want to be in the room. The quality of the work is equal to, or at times surpasses, the quality of the submissions from my face-to-face group. The face-to-face group has experiences that the online group won't have. Fair. But the online group has the flexibility and opportunities to tackle these assignments on a very personal level without feeling bombarded in class by their peers or afraid to have discussions or share their opinions or participate in anonymous polling or any of the other activities that we do, especially students who have experienced trauma. And we know statistically they are in our classes. I'm happy to say that Mastery Paths, as long as I am able to use it, and as long as this function continues to be available through Canvas and my institution, it will be something I lean on from now until I stop teaching human sexuality. I will look into how I can apply it to other courses, but I will caution you, front-loading all of this work, it does take a lot of time. And for professors, teachers, instructors who like to design as they go, or modify on the fly, it may be not as advantageous to have the pressure of front-loading a whole semester prior to launching the course. And with that, thank you and good luck.